It started like any other morning in Clearwater Estates' green lawns, trimmed hedges, a ridiculous number of American flags for people who likely never served a day in uniform. I had just finished watering the lawn when the first letter appeared on our porch. Neatly folded, triple stapled, and sealed in an envelope with a gold sticker that looked like it had been stolen off a third-place science fair trophy. I opened it and chuckled. Violation 7A. Unauthorized lawn ornament. Violation 3C. Unregistered vehicle in driveway. Violation 1Z. Failure to comply with architectural harmony clause. All within the span of 3 days. It was practically a record. I stared at the offending items listed in the complaint and rolled my eyes so hard I nearly saw into next week. The unregistered vehicle. That was my wife's sea bag, sitting next to our welcome home banner. The unauthorized ornament? A mini American flag near the mailbox. The architectural issue? A temporary vinyl banner that read, "Welcome home, Commander Sarah Callahan, USS Truman." My wife had been deployed for nearly a year aboard an aircraft carrier, commanding operations most civilians couldn't even comprehend. And yet, before she even touched US soil, our neighborhood, HOA Ed, by none other than Karen Witherspoon had, already decided she was a problem. I should have seen it coming. Karen wasn't just any HOA president. She was the kind of person who held emergency meetings over slightly mismatched garden mulch. She had once reported a neighbor for having improper lighting temperature on their porch during Christmas. Yes, temperature because warm yellow lights apparently clashed with the HOA's approved cool white aesthetic. Clearwater Estates was the kind of place where everyone smiled but no one meant it. If your grass grew half an inch too high, someone was already taking pictures for the violation report. Karen's clipboard wasn't a tool. It was a weapon. I decided to ignore the letters at first. Figured they'd move on once Sarah came home and people realized just how serious she was. But that wasn't how Clearwater worked. This wasn't about actual problems, it was about control. And nothing triggered Karen more than someone she couldn't control. The first time Karen came to the door, it was 8:45 a.m. I was midway through brewing coffee when I heard the forced knock, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission, it demands obedience. I opened the door and found her standing there like a discount Nancy Pelosi in a burnt orange pantsuit, her lips drawn in a tight line that hadn't relaxed since 1993. "Mr. Callahan," she said, with that clipped tone that people use when they want to sound professional but just come off condescending. "We sent notices regarding violations on your property. I'm here as a courtesy in case you haven't had time to read them." I leaned on the doorframe and gave her a smile I didn't mean. "Oh, I read them. Every stapled, bold font word." She looked over my shoulder.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Every stapled, bold font word. She looked over my shoulder like she was scanning for new offenses. The military gear in the driveway is inappropriate for a neighborhood of this nature, and the banner, while heartfelt, doesn't meet code. It disrupts the uniformity of our visual landscape. I blinked. It's a banner for my wife. She's returning from deployment. From a warship. She hasn't been home in 11 months. Karen offered me a rehearsed smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And we appreciate her service. Truly. But rules are rules." I stared at her. She didn't flinch. For a second, I wondered if this was a prank. Was I on camera? Was Ashton Kutcher about to jump out of a bush? But no. This was just Karen in her natural habitat. I sighed. "You do realize she commands a Navy carrier strike group, right? That she outranks every civilian in this neighborhood?" Karen's smile tightened. "Well, rank doesn't matter here, Mr. Callahan. In Clearwater Estates, everyone follows the same guidelines." That would have been hilarious if it weren't so insulting. Karen wasn't just blind to authority, she was willfully dismissive. She saw Sarah's career not as a badge of honor, but as a threat to her cardboard kingdom of suburban power plays. I didn't bother arguing further. Karen walked off down the sidewalk with the triumphant air of someone who'd just written a parking ticket for a visiting general. I knew then that Sarah would have to handle this herself. And handle it she did. When I picked her up from the base 3 days later, Sarah was tired, but alert. Her eyes had that sharp focus that never dulled, even after 22-hour shifts on a floating city. We hugged, and I loaded her gear into the truck. On the drive home, I filled her in on everything. I told her about the violation notices, the banner complaint, and the HOA drama. She didn't say much, just nodded and listened. But her jaw tightened, just slightly, and I recognized the look. It was the same expression she wore during mission briefings, right before executing a precision operation. When we pulled into the driveway, Sarah stepped out of the truck like she was exiting a helicopter. She scanned the house, the banner still fluttering in the breeze, the tiny flag by the mailbox standing proud. She smiled. Then she turned to me and said, "Don't take it down. Not a single inch." That Saturday, Karen returned with reinforcements to other HOA board members, each wielding their own clipboards and smug expressions. They approached the house in formation, like mall cops prepping for a raid. Sarah was sitting on the porch in a blue t-shirt with USS Truman command staff printed on the front. Her combat boots were laced tight, her posture impeccable. Karen cleared her throat. "Mrs. Callahan," she began, trying to sound civil. "We'd like to revisit the issue of non-compliant decorations and military storage visible from the street." Sarah stood up slowly. "Issue?" she asked. "I'm not aware of any legitimate issues here." Karen glanced at the banner. "The sign is not regulation, and we've received multiple complaints about a militant aesthetic." Sarah crossed her arms. "Let me be clear. That militant aesthetic is a welcome sign for a returning service member. And that duffel bag, that contains my gear, which has seen more action than this neighborhood ever will." One of the board members muttered something under his breath, but Sarah continued. "If you have an actual legal complaint, feel free to file it. But I'd advise you to check the Military Civil Relief Act and Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act before you try to enforce CAPTA. Civilian codes on active duty personnel." Karen blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "Are you threatening legal action?" she asked. Sarah smiled. "No, I'm stating facts. But if you'd like to escalate, I'll bring in Navy legal services. We'll see how your HOA holds up in federal review." The standoff was interrupted by Karen dramatically pulling out her phone.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
The standoff was interrupted by Karen dramatically pulling out her phone. "If you're going to threaten us," she said loudly, "then I'll be forced to involve the police." Sarah shrugged. "Go ahead. I'll be right here." 15 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled into the neighborhood. Officers stepped out cautiously, already sensing the tension. Karen rushed to them like a kid tattling on the playground. "She's aggressive, non-compliant, threatening legal retaliation. She's intimidating the board." The officers approached Sarah calmly. She greeted them with a handshake and handed over her Navy ID. Their demeanor changed instantly. One officer even saluted. Karen's face turned a shade of red I'd only seen once during a particularly embarrassing HOA potluck when someone brought non-gluten-free brownies. The senior officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, she's within her rights. Federal law protects active duty military and their families from discriminatory enforcement of local policies." Karen stammered. Bokishi threatened legal action. The officer looked unimpressed. "That's called asserting rights, ma'am, not a crime." Sarah thanked the officers, turned on her heel, and walked back up the porch like a seasoned admiral returning to her post. Karen was left standing in the driveway, clutching her clipboard like a lifebuoy in a storm. That night, I grilled steaks while Sarah reviewed the HOA's bylaws with the kind of surgical attention usually reserved for strategic defense operations. "This is weak," she said, pointing to one section. This clause contradicts federal protections. They have no enforcement authority over federally recognized uniforms or homecoming banners. I smiled. What are you going to do? Sarah looked up and said, I'm going to make sure Karen never forgets what chain of command really means. Over the next few days, Sarah filed 4 more complaints, not just with the HOA, but with the State Attorney General's office. She contacted the base's legal team and got a Navy liaison assigned to monitor the situation. She also held a press conference for military families in HOA communities, highlighting the rising trend of HOA harassment against veterans and active duty members. The story picked up traction. Local news stations showed up. Navy officer targeted by HOA for patriotism. Headlines exploded. Karen's clipboard empire began to crumble. Other residents began to voice their own grievances. Turns out, Karen's reign of tyranny had left more scars than anyone admitted. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Karen tried to maintain control, but the tide had turned. One neighbor stood up and said, "If you can't respect someone who's willing to die for your freedom, you don't deserve to run this community." The room erupted in applause. Karen resigned 2 days later. The banner stayed up for another month. The flag near our mailbox was upgraded to a permanent installation. And Sarah? She went on to lead a regional task force on veteran protections in residential communities. So when people ask what happened when HOA Karen called the cops because my wife returned from the USS Truman, I just smile and say, she outranked them all on land, at sea, and in every court that matters. After Karen's resignation, the neighborhood didn't exactly fall into chaos, but there was definitely a shift in the air. It was like someone had lifted the oppressive curtain that had blanketed Clearwater Estates for years. People began smiling more genuinely, waving from their driveways instead of disappearing behind hedges. For the first time since moving in, I actually felt like this place might be worth calling home. But Karen didn't disappear. Not entirely. While her official position on the HOA board was vacated, her presence lingered like the smell of burnt coffee, bitter and impossible to ignore. We saw her walking the neighborhood more than ever now, as if hoping to catch someone out of line. She'd glare from across the street, whisper to her new circle of HOA loyalists, mostly retirees, who didn't like the idea of change and make not-so-subtle jabs in community Facebook posts. Sad to see some people confuse uniform with superiority, she wrote once. Neighborhoods should be run by people, not by titles on ships. Sarah ignored it. Completely. She had far bigger things to handle. The incident had put her on the radar of not just local media, but also the Department of Defense's family readiness programs. They wanted her insight, her leadership. She was invited to a roundtable in DC to speak about the treatment of military families in civilian housing developments. The HOA power abuse had touched a nerve that ran deeper than Clearwater. All across the country, stories were emerging. Military spouses fined for putting up welcome home signs. Active duty members penalized for short-term lawn neglect during deployments. Veterans harassed for wearing uniforms. Sarah became the unofficial spokesperson for everyone who'd been told to tone it down in their own homes. But while she was making national waves, Karen was building a quieter rebellion. She began working behind the scenes to get herself re-elected. She couldn't stand being powerless. She started hosting informal tea gatherings at her house. She began a whisper campaign claiming Sarah had used her military status to intimidate civilians and got the cops involved to cover up her own violations. Lease, of course. But lees have legs in places like Clearwater Estates. Things escalated when a surprise notice showed up in our mailbox one morning. Notice of Special Hearing Property Use Review. The letter accused us of ongoing failure to comply with visual and architectural standards, even citing improper uniform display on private property. It was the same nonsense, but now dressed up in new paper.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
It was the same nonsense, but now dressed up in new paperwork. The kicker? The board had changed. New names, new faces, but all Karen's allies. Sarah read it over breakfast, barely reacting. "She's trying to bait us," she said. Let her. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Sarah, naturally, prepared like it was a mission briefing. She gathered military legal codes, state laws, our deed, HOA bylaws, and even transcripts of the officer body cam footage from the original police call. She wasn't going to argue. She was going to bury them. The day of the hearing, we walked into the community clubhouse. The same room Karen used to rule like it was her own courtroom. She was seated in the back row, arms crossed, eyes burning. The new board president, a younger woman named Susan, opened the floor, trying to sound neutral. "We're here today to discuss the continued disruption caused by non-compliance with HOA policy and the conflict between military display and community standards." Sarah stood up slowly, calmly. She introduced herself not as a military officer, but as a homeowner, a taxpayer, and a resident. She spoke clearly, deliberately. "I served aboard the USS Truman for the last year. My return home was not just a moment for me, it was for my family, my community, and every woman or man who has ever put on a uniform. The banner you're referring to was not an act of defiance, it was an act of pride. If your policy considers that disruptive, then the problem isn't the homeowner, it's the policy." Then she brought out the documents. The laws. The HOA contradictions. She even showed copies of the original fines Karen had issued without board approval, something strictly prohibited in the bylaws. The board began shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Susan tried to speak, but Sarah wasn't finished. "Your enforcement isn't just incorrect, it's illegal. The Military Civil Relief Act protects service members and their families from precisely this kind of harassment. Your own charter conflicts with state and federal law in 3 separate areas. I've already filed complaints with the Attorney General and with military legal services. This hearing is a formality. You're not deciding whether I broke the rules. You're deciding whether this board wants to be dragged into court on Karen Witherspoon's behalf." The room was silent. A few people even clapped. Not, ironically, actually clapped. Karen stood up then, trying to regain control. "You think you can bully your way through this neighborhood?" she shouted. "You think that uniform makes you untouchable?" Sarah didn't even look at her. "No. But it does mean I swore to protect the Constitution, and that includes from people like you." Karen stormed out. The board closed the hearing, and a week later sent a letter apologizing for the unwarranted scrutiny. But the story didn't end there. Sarah was asked to testify before a state Senate subcommittee about HOA overreach. She was flown to DC twice more, even received a letter of recognition from the Secretary of the Navy. She was approached to co-author new legislation that would require mandatory training for HOA boards on veteran and military family protections. Meanwhile, Karen's own world began to unravel. An anonymous complaint had been filed with the IRS about undeclared HOA dues income. The property inspector showed up one morning, investigating unpermitted renovations she had done on her backyard gazebo. Rumors swirled that her husband, who hadn't been seen in months, had quietly filed for divorce. Her once loyal board allies began to distance themselves, especially as media attention grew.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
To distance themselves, especially as media attention grew. One reporter even knocked on our door for an interview. Sarah declined, respectfully. "I didn't do this for revenge," she said. "I did it so no one else would have to go through it." But the truth? Karen had made it personal. And Sarah wasn't the type to forget. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork in the garage, we found copies of earlier HOA newsletters, ones we had missed. Turns out, Karen had been building her little empire for years, issuing rule updates without formal votes, revising clauses in the middle of the night, and intimidating residents who pushed back. Sarah made one phone call to a retired Navy JAG she'd worked with, Within days, a formal audit of the HOA's governance was launched. Karen was subpoenaed for records. The state came down hard. Missing funds, unauthorized fines, unreported collections was a mess. The final blow came when a lawsuit was filed by 4 separate residents alleging financial misconduct and emotional distress. Karen's lawyer tried to settle. Quietly. Privately. But word got out. Karen sold her house and moved out within 2 months. No farewell party. No warm goodbye. Just a moving truck and a bitter wind. As for us, we stayed. Sarah started a community outreach program helping veterans navigate civilian life, especially in gated communities like ours. She became something of a legend in the area. Not because she won a fight, but because she changed the battlefield. Our neighbors began referring to the whole incident as the Truman affair. A local artist even painted a mural on the back wall of the clubhouse, an abstract version of a carrier returning to port, with a bold flag waving above it. No one protested. No one complained. And as for the banner, it's framed in our living room now, right next to Sarah's medals. When people ask if it was worth it, I always say the same thing. Karen called the cops. She called the board. She called the press. But in the end, the only thing she truly accomplished was calling out the one person in the neighborhood you never want to pick a fight with. The woman who commands at sea, in court, and in every room she enters. The woman who doesn't just outrank people on paper but in principle, purpose, and pure grit. Karen forgot that, sometimes, authority isn't about barking orders. It's about service, leadership, respect. And when Sarah stepped off that ship and into Clearwater Estates, she didn't just come home, she reminded everyone what real command looks like. No clipboard, no violation form, and no HOA badge could ever stand a chance.